This is Notes in the Margin, a podcast for people who are super excited about writing their non-fiction book, but perhaps, just perhaps, aren't quite doing it. If you always feel called to tile the bathroom or clean the toilet instead of writing your book, you are in the right place. Your host, Vicky Quinn-Fraser, has been there, done that, and has literally written the book about it. Join Vicky and her husband Joe as they make notes in the margin about creativity, writing techniques, publishing, and general shenanigans, and get tips and tricks to help you write your book. Hello and welcome to the Notes in the Margin podcast. I've forgotten what my own podcast was called then. Today I am joined by a friend of the podcast, Sharon Hurley Hall. She's been on before. We were talking about her the book that she was writing at the time, which is called I'm Tired of Racism, and the subtitle True Stories of Existing While Black. And we have had an amazing chat, and I really hope that you enjoy it as much as I did. But I also hope that you go and buy her book. It's a fantastic read. I know that sometimes, you know, us white people can be a bit leery about, is this going to be a really difficult read? Is it going to be really finger pointy? Is it going to be this, that, and the other? It's not. Sharon is a writer by trade. She's an amazing writer. If you haven't signed up for her newsletter already, then you absolutely should, and there'll be a link in the show notes. But the book is such a great read. It's really enjoyable, and I know that sounds like a funny thing to say because there's also really tough stories to read in there. There's stuff that will make you go, why is this still happening? There's stuff that will enrage you, there's stuff that will surprise you, but it's also a really enjoyable read. And Sharon writes from a place of joy and a place of wanting to change the world and to make it a better place, not just for Black people, but for everybody, because that's what will happen. It's like we can make the world better for everybody, not just for one small or big group. So yeah, that's what we're talking about. We talk about all sorts of things. We talk about names, we talk about history, we talk about books. Obviously, we talk about books and writing. We talk about fiction. We go on a bit of a safari about the wondrousness that is the Netflix show How to Get Away with Murder. So I really hope you enjoy this podcast. Sharon Hurley Hall, welcome back, friend of the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me again. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, Vicky, and thank you so much for having me. It's so delightful to be having a conversation with you again.
Oh, well, the pleasure is mine. Having just said that we're not videoing this, I'm now waving Sharon's book around because that's what we are talking about today. Sharon's latest book, I'm Tired of Racism, came out a couple of months ago.
October 1st.
October 1st. Yeah. And I've got a beautiful hardback copy, which is full of tabs, because I've been tabbing and making notes and reading, and that is what I want to talk about with you today, because this is what I do. I'm all about books, and I'm all about books that should be read and books that will make the world a better place. So can you tell us what prompted you to write this book? Because there's lots of books on anti-racism, especially since 2020. So what was your reason for writing this book?
The genesis of this book came from my anti-racism newsletter, which I started in 2020. And from a throwaway comment where someone said, I get so much stuff in my inbox. I would love to read your stuff, but it would be great if it were all collected together. And that is literally what prompted me to start collecting some of the essays. So they started out as email newsletters about anti-racism. And late in 2020, I put what was the start of this collection together. And it's taken me a whole 2 years to actually get the book out for one reason or another. In that time, I got it professionally edited. I got a professional cover design, all the things that I'm sure you recommend. Even though it's a self-published book, I wanted it to look and feel like a really high quality product. Absolutely. And it does, by the way. Oh, thank you.
Also, I love that. But so many books start off with somebody saying, I love your stuff. Can you not just put it in a book format? And then the person's like, oh yeah, I could do that, couldn't I?
Yeah.
And there it is. So, okay, so it must have been tough at times writing this book, because having read it, and it must have been enraging as well. It's like, why are we still talking about this? So how did you find the process of creating this book, and how did it compare to the first book you wrote, which is, for listeners, is called Exploring Shadeism? And I'm going to ask you about that in a bit as well. But how did you find the process of writing it?
The process of this was somewhat different. Exploring Shadeism came out of a research project that I had done. And so at the time, it didn't land with me. I'm tired of racism. I mean, the subtitle is True Stories of Existing While Black, and a lot of it is stuff that has actually happened to me and to people that I know. So this is much more personal in a way. But, my background is journalism and teaching. And so I tend to like to use these stories to give people a way into that experience. Yes, there were some things where I was writing them and I was thinking, honestly, I can't believe people had that attitude. I can't believe that actually happened, but yet it did.
Mm-hmm.
And there were a few pieces which were sad. There were a few pieces which were annoying. It's a real mix of emotions, I would say.
Yeah, I can quite imagine that. And what are you hoping that people will get from reading the book? What's your kind of aim with kind of putting it out there and getting, I guess, people that look like me to read it?
Okay, so for people that look like you, I want them to have a window in what it's like to walk in my skin and be motivated and inspired to do something about racism, to end it, to be an ally, to be an advocate for anti-racism, to do all those things to nip this thing in the bud and stop it in its tracks. But I have another audience, which is people who look like me.
Yes.
And I want those people to feel seen and understood, to know that they're not alone in having these experiences, that in fact, they're sadly all too common.
Yeah. Okay. And so what do you think? Because from that, one of the chapters that I really loved, and one of the reasons that I really love the fact that you've written this book as well, I love the Not All Black People chapter, because that for me was just, I mean, we talk about representation matters and all the rest of it, but there's that problem of groups of people being seen as a monolith. And so that was one of the chapters that I really loved, because it's like, yes, okay, this is kind of an experience that is universal, but also this is your personal experience, which might be different from others. And so I guess that's perhaps one of the things that you wanted to share. And it's like, do you think, what feedback have you had from that specifically, and from the book from other Black people?
I've had universally positive feedback from, most people, actually. It's been amazing. Black people really say, yes, I was nodding, I was saying, aha, I really related to that. And I think that they, like others, like the fact that it both universalizes and personalizes the experience in a way, right? Because there are a lot of things that, as you say, within this piece, there are a lot of things that apply to a lot of us, and there are a lot of things that are my experience. But there are other people that have experiences like mine. And so, we often say Black people are not a monolith. And this piece illustrates that, that gives you, it gives you a chance to say, well, hey, I've been thinking this way, but maybe there are other ways to think about this. Maybe there are other ways to think about Black experiences. Black experience is what I say instead of the Black experience, because there is no one Black experience.
Yeah. I know that happens in other, like we talk about, the Black community and the gay community and the LGBT. Why do you think this happens, this lumping together of groups of people who, and it's, it's predominantly white people who do this. It's like, why do you think that happened? Where do you think it comes from?
Lack of knowledge, perhaps, a lack of understanding. And that's the best case scenario, right? I think sometimes there's fear of what is perceived as the other.
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of things going on there. And books like mine, because, as you say, there are many, give people a chance to say, well, okay, let me get a little bit of understanding. Let me start to see people as individuals with some shared experiences. And let me think about what I can do in my sphere to not continue to perpetrate racism.
Yeah, and that's another reason why I think books are such a powerful tool for people to do this, because, and not only nonfiction either, because I think a lot of the time, people, they have a big like, oh, I need to do something. And, I'm going to go read the books. It's like, I'm going to go read the books. That's fine. But they tend to focus on the non-fiction books. It's like, let's read the fiction as well that other people are writing, that people who don't look like us and don't come from the same backgrounds as us. And so where do you think that fits into the whole kind of empathy issue that people really, for whatever reason, struggle to put themselves in someone else's shoes? How can people widen their reading beyond non-fiction, beyond personal stories?
I agree with you, Vicky. It's important to read stories that are coming out of a different paradigm, coming from a different background. Seek out Black authors and read about things from their perspective. I mean, you have the Toni Morrisons and the Alice Walkers of this world, but you have other people. And why am I blanking on the name right now? I remember reading a novel, and I was like 2/3 of the way in, and I realized, hey, the main character is actually Black. And it was through something that they said about hair. And I said, hey, this is not a white person, right? But, as Black people, we're often used to seeing ourselves left out of the narratives or in the narratives as this kind of sideshow. And I think that for white people, it's important to look at, there are hundreds and thousands of Black authors around the globe writing all kinds of books. If you want rom-coms, if you want cheesy romances, if you want sci-fi, if you want detective fiction, no matter what kind of reading you like, you can find Black writers writing it. So just broaden it out.
Yeah, and TV as well. I'm currently obsessed with Netflix's How to Get Away with Murder, which is just it's such a great show, and I love that as well because, like you said, it's that kind of fiction, but it's not like the main character played magnificently by Viola Davis. It's not like, oh, here is a Black person that is a role about specific. It's like it could be anybody, and obviously it's about her experience as a Black woman as well. Yeah. But just like that's one of the things that struck me was like this shouldn't be surprising, but yet it is, and it's such a good show as well. I guess you've been watching it.
It is a very good show. She does a magnificent job, and she does a really good job of normalizing certain experiences, because as you say, the fact that she's Black is both integral to her character, but also not in a way because she's a lawyer, she's she's in trouble, that could be anyone. But then there's certain things that she does that are definitely coded to represent the Black audience. And I think she does a magnificent job of bringing them all together and making everybody interested and enhancing people's knowledge.
Yes. Yeah, in just tiny little ways. And one of the ways that struck me with that was the hair wraps that she wears every night that you see, and it's just there as part of Black women's hair care that most people don't know. And I just love that.
Yeah.
That was just those little touches. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, well, I could talk about that show all day, but we're not going to. So here is a question, almost kind of following on from that. What do you think the biggest misunderstanding or misconception that white people have about what racism actually is?
Ooh, now that's a good question, Vicky. A lot of white people think that racism is either nasty words or the KKK. Right? There's a whole range of stuff that happens in between there. We've seen an example in late 2022. There was the example of Ngozi Fulani and Lady Susan Hussey and the repeated questioning as to her origin. Now, a lot of people will say, well, how is it bad to ask where are you from? But the clue is in two things. The clue is in the rarely from, as in you're not competent to say where you're from. You told me that you're from the UK, but I don't believe you. So that's what the rarely is questioning. And then the repeated levels of questioning and insistence. Again, this is something a lot of Black people go through. I myself am also British. I lived primarily in England for 15 years. I'm now in the Caribbean. And I got that question on a fairly regular basis. And it was never just the one question. Yeah. So, when I saw that happen, I think, a lot of us could relate to that because it's something that happens to us often. And it is extremely othering. It's the experiences in the office where, you walk in as a Black woman and people assume you're there to make the tea and not to present, right? It's you're standing in a shop, you're standing in Asda, right? Looking at clothing, and someone comes up and asks you about pricing and where to find something because you can't be shopping, you have to be serving.
Yeah.
It's the, all those little things that people call microaggressions, but are really just racism. And there's nothing micro about the way that they feel, which I think I wrote about as well in the Paper Cuts article.
Yeah, death by 1,000 paper cuts. Yeah.
Yes. It's the exclusion. It's there have been a lot of stories in the British press in the last several months about how Black children are treated in the education system, how they are almost criminalized. Mm-hmm. And, I want to say here that, one of the things that I try to do in the book, because I'm someone that has lived in the UK, I've lived in the Caribbean, I've lived in France, I visited the US, is to bring that global lens to things, right? Mm. And, a lot of people say, oh, but Britain's not racist. Look, we abolished the slave trade in 1807.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
They, completely ignoring, Britain's role in funding the slave trade in the first place.
Yeah.
Right? In brutalizing people, in genocide of people of African origin, completely ignoring all of that. And also thinking that because generally Black people don't immediately get shot, that is somehow, raises Britain's racism, out of the doldrums. And it doesn't. And no. It doesn't, because, there are all kinds of ways in which Black people are othered in their everyday experience. And I can't remember if I talked about this last time. I was living in Southampton, and one night I walked up to a bus stop. It was a cold night, right? Decemberish, right? I had on a coat. My hair was short and natural. Mm-hmm. And the woman in front of me gathered herself together, grabbed her bag, and scooted a few paces ahead of me. And I was just waiting for the bus. Mm-hmm. I honestly had no interest in her manky bag, I have to say. Right?
Yeah.
But it's in those things as well as the things like, not getting jobs, if you have seeing how people react. I may have talked about this last time I was on as well, right? So the double take, right? My name, Sharon Hurley Hall. In the days before social media, when, you'd send in a CV, mm-hmm. right? I would get to the interview stage and I would walk through the door and people would just rein back a little bit, like, wait, we were not expecting a Black woman. And sometimes the shock was so extreme that I knew I was never going to get the job.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of the stories that I read out to my husband a couple of days ago, actually. I was just like, the one where you had the same interview as a white colleague, and she knew that you were going to get the job because, you were better qualified and all of that on paper, and then you didn't.
I didn't.
And it's just like, well, and I think I love the fact that you told that story. You shouldn't have to tell that story, but I love the fact that you told that story in this book, because I also know what a lot of white people's reactions will be, because it's always the same. It's like, oh, you're playing the race card, you're doing this, you're doing that. And it's like, that is, you shouldn't have to prove it. You shouldn't have to prove it. But it's like, that is a really good example of, look, actually, this is a case where I can flip and prove it, because, my colleague said that she shouldn't have got the job. And it's... Yeah, that kind of story, I think, is really valuable because it just dismantles that nonsense that people come back with. And it's just like, there's just one story. That,
and can I jump in there on the subject of so-called playing the race card?
Yeah.
Right? Black people don't want to find racism, right? They don't want to have to deal with racism. The people that play the race card, frankly, are white people.
Yeah.
That's why we have to keep talking about it.
Yeah.
Right? Because of the racism that affects our everyday lives.
Yeah.
And because if we don't talk about it, not enough other people are talking about it. And the only way to get people to do something about it is to raise awareness and get somebody to to do something. Because, further to your previous point, Vicky, there are a lot of books. People can do a lot of reading. My question and challenge is, when you have read the books, what are you doing with that information to change things?
Yes. Yeah. And it's a really good question as well. And I think something else that popped up in the book, I'm not sure I wrote it down, so it might pop into my head in a bit, but it's this idea of getting uncomfortable and having the uncomfortable conversations. Because I can say right now, talking to you, this is not a comfortable conversation for me, and it shouldn't be, because, but yet we do it, and it's not hard in the sense that, so this is like me talking to other white people listening. It's like, have conversations, but have good conversations. And on that note, I'm going to just segue into a different question, because I loved that you explained in your book why certain things are problematic, why certain things that we do are problematic, like why it's not okay to rock up to your Black friend and ask for all of the gory details about what's going on in their lives, why we should be doing as much independent research as we can. And it's not that you're being difficult, it's trauma, and you don't want to talk about it. So, but you also said we do that research so we can have a more informed conversation. And so I wanted to ask, what might such a conversation look like if we get past all of the basics that people should be doing on their own? What would you like to be talking about with people?
I'm all about, how do we change things? How do we fix things? How do we make them better? And so if I don't have to have that basic conversation about what actually is going on and why something is a problem, then we can talk about, what could you do that would make things better? And actually, it's something that I do a lot in my newsletter, is that I challenge people to take that information away and do something. Sometimes doing something starts with noticing something you've never paid attention to before. And then sometimes then you have a conversation about, okay, so, you've seen your Black colleague get spoken over and ignored in meetings. How are you going to do that? Sometimes that looks like saying to the meeting at large, well, actually, I'm glad you picked up on that point Sharon made. Sharon, do you have anything to add on that point? Sometimes it looks like, when you see someone asking your Black colleague to make the tea, you say, well, I don't think that's on, I'll do it. It looks like, small acts of advocacy and support. And it looks like larger acts. It looks like, are our policies at work actually supporting the experiences of all people equally? Are certain people more likely to be discriminated against? The answer is yes. Are certain people more likely to be put on performance improvement plans? The answer is yes. Are certain people less likely to get the pay raise that goes with their role if they're a different color? The answer is also yes. And so if you have the power to do something about it or bring that discussion to the table, then we can talk about it. And, I think a lot of white people have the fear that in doing this, they're going to lose something, right? Yeah. Lose something that was never really theirs in the first place, lose an unearned advantage.
Yeah.
But the truth is that it makes the place more welcoming, more equal, and better for everyone. And then you get a window into experiences that you might not otherwise have had. And everybody feels that they belong.
Yeah. Yeah, that's such an important point. It's like this idea that equality somehow takes away from other people. It doesn't. It lifts everyone. It lifts everyone, and everyone is better off for it. And the experience of living is richer. So, it's like how
exactly.
And this idea of like power with instead of power over, because traditionally, yes, white people have had this power over other people, and I've never understood that. It's like, why? But like this power with, so that everybody can just be who they are.
Well, let me segue very quickly. So okay. The company that I'm with, Mission Equality, formerly Diverse Leaders Group, is all about how do we empower leaders and others to get to equality. And we changed the name of the company recently to make it clear what our focus is, right? On the way to that, you have to sometimes do equity steps to redress the balance and right the wrongs of the past.
Mm-hmm.
But all of that is what is right and just, for everyone as human beings. Yeah. You have to have empathy. You have to value humanity. And if you do those things, how can you not want equality? And how can you not do what is necessary? And so books like this and fiction help people start to get to lay the groundwork, the internal groundwork for having conversations and for doing more. And it's something that, we've seen is that there is a power in having conversations and helping people to think differently.
Yeah.
One of the things that I'm involved with, my co-founder Leah, is running groups, which we called allies groups, although that's not strictly what they are, but basically support groups where people get prompted to discuss things, can bring their questions in a place where we're saying, okay, here's a space where it's okay to ask questions and there are no silly questions in this space, and to think about things from a different lens. And sometimes once people see something, they can't unsee it.
Yeah.
Once people know something, they can't unknow it. So when you know that Black and brown people, that Asian people, that Indigenous people, that whoever is being treated inequitably in your community, in your workplace, in your school, then the question is, what are you as a white person that has this unearned advantage and power going to do to fix it?
Yeah. And it's a good question. I love the fact that you created a group for people to come and ask those questions as well, because I know, I can speak from my personal experience. One of my fears is always, I'm going to screw up, I'm going to do the wrong thing. And it's like, yeah, at some point I am. But it's good to, it's amazing that you've created that space where it's okay for that to happen in that space. And, you don't have to be afraid of that. It's like, it's just going to happen, get over it, do better. It's a really powerful space, and we've been facilitating these spaces for a couple of years now, and I have seen white people get more confident in tackling racism, in challenging it when they see people saying silly things online, in challenging it in their communities, by writing letters, by holding other white people to account, and in continuing to expand their own knowledge. It's really, really powerful. Yeah. It is, and I'm hoping that you will share a link to that at the end, because
I will.
Excellent. I wanted to go back even further, actually, because talking about what we can do and how we can change things. I did not at school learn the things that I now know in history, and honestly, I'm pretty angry about that, because it's apart from the fact that it's just wrong, it's my history as well, and so I haven't been taught. So, which is part of the reason, by the way, that I'm grateful to you and other people like you who are willing to tell your stories and show us a little bit more about all of our shared history. But do you think a good place to start as young as possible might be actually teaching the real damn history of this country? I'm talking about the UK because that's where I'm from. But yeah, could that be a good place to start?
Yes. That is a good place to start, but it also starts even earlier. As a parent, what are the books on your children's bookshelves? What faces and experiences are represented in those books? There are shed loads of books that feature a rainbow coalition of faces and experiences. Now, I'm speaking as someone who had access to, Enid Blyton when I was growing up, and I loved the stories. I really, really did. I didn't see myself in them, but I loved them nonetheless. Mm-hmm. But you better believe that when my child was growing up, I also found books. She read Enid Blyton, yes, but she also read books that had characters that looked like her.
Yeah.
Okay, my daughter's biracial. Okay, so I think it starts with that. It starts with, find the books that, that your Black friends, if you have any, or yeah, we could talk about that another time, right? Find the books that Black parents are reading to their children and sharing with their children, and make sure some of those are on your bookshelves as well. So you normalize the fact that there are people of all hues in your orbit, and they don't become strange. Because I'll tell you, children don't start out racist.
No.
They will look at us and they'll say, oh, well, you're dark brown and you're kind of pink, and, it will be a very neutral thing for them.
Yeah.
Right? My daughter, when she was little, thought that her dad was silver. Okay. Right? And so, we can nip that in the bud really, really early. But yes, then you have to tell the real history, not just the history that says, oh, we were a great colonial power and we went out and we conquered the world. Tell, what's the other side? Talk about the genocide, talk about the enslavement, talk about the brutalization, talk about the extractive capitalist mindset, talk about all of that stuff. And obviously there are different ways that you'll talk about that at different ages, but make it balanced, right? And also make sure, because, most countries have quite a diverse population. Make sure that the other people, that it's not just the white people who feel seen and empowered. And I cannot stress this enough, the history of Black people or brown people, the history of Black people does not start with enslavement. The history of brown people does not start with when Britain went to India. Mm-hmm. The history of Chinese and Japanese people does not start with whenever Britain first went to those areas. These are all countries and regions with ancient traditions and histories, and that needs to be understood.
Yeah.
That needs to be understood. And we need to surface the hidden histories, right?
Yeah, and why wouldn't we want to know that? Because it's so, I'm a bit biased because I studied archaeology and ancient history at uni, so I'm interested in ancient stuff anyway, but it's like, why would you not want to know this stuff? It's really interesting.
It is.
Yeah.
And then you see people in a different way, and you think, well, hey, maybe if my ancestors had been enslaved and I had been denied opportunities, and maybe I would be a little bit upset about that too.
Yeah, just seeing things in a different way. And this is one of the things I've got. I don't know if this is a question so much as me thinking out loud, but from that idea of seeing things in a different way, I've heard white people mutter about Black sounding names. I'm doing air quotes for the benefit of people listening to this, especially in America. So names like Beyonce and Deshaun, and they mutter about made up names and silly spellings and that kind of similar nonsense. And it just got me thinking about those names and why they grew up. Is it a move away from colonizers' names? Because I know you mentioned this in your book. You talk about anglicized names and how often they come from the slave ownership and from the products of rape, which is such, as you said, such a mind trip. So it makes sense to move away from that. So is that where those names are come from? Is that about claiming a new tradition and a new identity?
I think that, and it'd be interesting to go back to the history of that. I know certainly in the Caribbean, and I suspect it might be the same in other places, with the Black Power movements in the 70s, coming out of the civil rights movement in the 60s, with Black people thinking, okay, there's more to our story than just having been enslaved and colonized. A lot of people went back to what they could find of their African roots and found names that represented something in those traditions and adopted them, right? And, sometimes they change the spelling because, now you are, several centuries later, you change the spelling to something that matches the pronunciation, or you don't change the spelling and make people have to figure it out, And I think a lot of those names come out of that tradition. And actually going back to the story of Ms. Fulani, one of the pieces that I saw written about it, because people were saying, oh, well, that's not her real name, air quotes, right? Because she was born something else. And the person who wrote the article made the same point that you just made, which is that, the name she was christened with comes out of a heritage of enslavement and rape. And, a lot of people choose to distance themselves from that. And why wouldn't they? Mm-hmm. And, how is that any different from anyone else deciding to change their name by deed poll? Right. It doesn't become suspect because she's a Black woman, right? And in fact, more Black people should probably change their names if that's what they want to do.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating to me on an intellectual level, but also from a really human level as well. It's like, well, why? Thinking that, going that little bit deeper and thinking, well, where did this come from? Why do people have the names that they have? And thinking, like you say, beyond that surface level of, that it's just a different name to others. Yes. Give it a little bit more thought.
Actually, interestingly on that, I was in Trinidad a few years ago where there's still some remnants of the Taino population, the people that I think they used to call Arawaks, right? And so the guy that was the head of the current group came out, and he said his name was Miguel something. And I said, well, there's an example right there, right? Whatever names existed in their languages before colonization have gone, and they were left with these names of Spanish heritage, right? So again, I mean, it's also not something that has only happened to Black people. It has happened to other people. It has happened to indigenous people around the world, you know. And I honestly don't see anything wrong with saying, okay, I want to reclaim that heritage. I've gone and I've done my ancestry DNA or African ancestry. I've figured out where my ancestors came from, and I want a name that recognizes that heritage. And a lot of these names, you know, they carry meaning and power. I mean, all our names do. It's just that we've forgotten, right? They all mean something, but we've forgotten, right? But in other countries and traditions, that's not forgotten. And some of those names have power and meaning. And why wouldn't you want to do that?
Yeah. Thank you. Why wouldn't you indeed? It's like, reclaim some of that heritage, create a new identity if you can't. And you know, there's nothing wrong with that. It's, like you say, it's no different from changing your name via deed poll or getting married, changing your name, whatever. Yeah. So there are so many other things that I want to talk to you about, but we are running, I'm conscious of your time. And so again, it's like, I'll come back another time and we'll talk about more things if you're willing. But I think we're gonna have to wrap it up, because otherwise we're gonna go on a big tangent about things that will take much longer than this, because I also wanted to talk about the intersection. Actually, I can just say this. It's like, white women, if you're listening, you should have a little bit more empathy here, because you talk about in your book, you talk about the white gaze. I know about the male gaze, you know about the white gaze and the male gaze. And it's just, you know, there's just like the sense of self that you get from other people looking at you. And, you know, and I say we as in white women, we should be a lot more empathetic, because we know what it's like to have our sense of self defined by who we're being looked at, you know, by, and you've got that extra layer as well. So, and this is not something you're going to be able to answer in a couple of minutes, but I'm still getting my head around the intersection of feminism and racism, and how white feminism can be problematic. And where is a good place for us to start with that, do you think?
Okay, well, we'll start with the work of Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who wrote about intersectionality. I can't call to mind the name of her book or work at the moment.
I'll find it in the show notes.
But that is a good place to start, and then follow the trails from there. And you know, look at the people that you're following on social media. You know, there are people with lots and lots of intersectionalities. I follow a Black disabled woman who has a disability consultancy called Andrea Levant. You know, there are people upon people. You know, there are people who are Black and queer. There are people who are Black and non-binary. Madison Butler is fabulous.
She's amazing.
Right? You know, I mean, there are loads of people. You know, just broaden your circle.
Thank you.
Right?
Yeah, and that's a much bigger conversation to talk about another time. But I just wanted to just touch on that a little bit, because I just think it's really important, because white women can be extremely problematic. So, so thank you, Sharon. Thank you so much. You are so generous and wise with your time and your energy. Where can we buy your amazing book, I'm Tired of Racism, True Stories of Existing While Black?
You can go to bookstoread.com/tired of racism, which has pretty much everywhere that it's available. It is available on Amazon, currently available in hardback and ebook, paperback coming in February, audiobook coming when I can record it.
Same line, yeah.
And yeah.
Where else can we find out more about you? What can people do if they want to do better, if they want to learn more from you, if they want to pay you the money to learn more from you? Where can they
Take a paid subscription to my anti-racism newsletter. It's on antiracismnewsletter.com. You get more of what's in the book. If you like the book, there's more, much more.
It's amazing. It's amazing. I love your newsletter. It's one of the few that I read every single issue of. So, yeah.
Oh, thank you, Vicky. That's really good to hear. You can also connect with me on missionequality.com. Community.missionequality.com is where we do anti-racism prompts, and we also look after intersectionality. So we do discussions for other things as well, and that's a way in there. My website is sharonhh.com, which I have sadly neglected, but does still exist. And of course, you can connect with me on LinkedIn.
Yes, which is where we met. So
yes.
Yeah, LinkedIn. Love LinkedIn. It's got its problems, but I also love it. So Sharon, thank you so much. You are amazing, as always. Thank you so much for talking to me about your book and about your life and about the world and how to make it better. I really, really appreciate it. And I know that other people, I hope everybody who's listening has been taking notes and will go find out more. And I will leave it there. I'm terrible at finishing things. So thank you so much, Sharon. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, Vicky. I am happy to come back and talk to you again anytime. There's always so much to say on these topics, isn't there?
They never end.
No. And thank you. It's been a pleasure as always.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. And Sharon, thank you again so much for your generous time and energy and wisdom. It was an absolute pleasure talking to you as always. And if you want to go and find Sharon's book, then the link is in the show notes. She gave us a link. Also consider joining her paid newsletter if you want to do something material that will, actually help to change the world and amplify Black voices. Join her newsletter. It's not expensive. It's extremely good value and it's very interesting, very helpful, gives you plenty of resources, places to start if you're ready to start doing a little bit more to make the world a more equitable place. You can also find out more about her communities, the space that she creates for people to come and ask the questions that might be uncomfortable, to say, to talk about the things that can be difficult to talk about, because I worry all the time I'm going to say the wrong thing and screw up. And I will at some point, and I am going to screw up. And that's okay, because we can apologize and make it right and move on and do better. And that's not just in the field of racism and anti-racism. It's in the field of literally living and being a human. It's it's okay to make mistakes, which, by the way, is another facet of white supremacy. This idea that we have to be perfect all the damn time. Nah, that's exhausting. Doesn't happen. We learn, we move on, we grow. So go find out more about Sharon's spaces. Pick up her book, I'm Tired of Racism, read it, make notes on it. I've got lots of post-it notes in my copy of it, and enjoy. And if you have questions, go find her on LinkedIn. If you have questions that you can Google them first. But if you have questions for Sharon herself, go find her on LinkedIn. Be respectful and find out more. If you have questions, by the way, also, you can ask me and I will answer where I can and point you in the right direction where I can't. And if you would like to write your own book, by the way, I am running Microbook Magic again. At time of recording, I have 11 of the 20 spaces have gone, so there are 9 spaces left. We kick off on the 10th of January, so you've got a few days left to join, and the link for that is in the show notes too. So thank you so much, Sharon. Thank you to Podfly for putting this together and making it sound great. And thank you to you, dear listener, for listening in. I really appreciate you. We'll be back same time next week. Thanks so much for listening. Check out the show notes at moxiebooks.co.uk/podcast for links to everything we've mentioned in this episode. Remember to subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcast from. And if you'd like to hear more from Notes in the Margin, you can sign up to get regular emails from Vicky into your inbox at moxiebooks.co.uk/notes in the margin. We'll be back same time next week.